Well, good morning, everybody. The purpose of this workshop is to organize thinking about that, the importance of collecting data, and especially within an RTI framework, but how to do it in an effective, efficient way, how to know what we're doing about that data and to use it appropriately to inform our decisions. The information that I'm going to share with you today is condensed from a training manual. This is created as a follow-up to this workshop in the same way that we are recording this. You can go to the Read Naturally website later and you can listen to this again. But this manual organizes this same information in a way so that you can continue to inform yourself or take that back and work with your colleagues. Another way we share this information, for the last several summers, I have partnered with my good friends here at Read Naturally to do a series of one-day workshops. What we're taking essentially in this 1-hour presentation is that full-day workshop and touching on the highlights. This is the schedule for this past summer, so these are not dates coming up, but I included this slide as a reminder to share this information with you, that we do these around the country, and probably somewhere in, I would guess, winter, early spring this year, we'll pick the dates and start advertising those again. So if deepening your understanding, or if you have colleagues or administrators or others who would like to have a clearer understanding or a deeper understanding about how to collect and use appropriate assessment, not too much, but what we collect, make sure we're using it. You can look forward, think about possibly attending these workshops. I'm finding, as I mentioned before, that schools everywhere are collecting more data, and that's part of the efforts that I see schools engaged in to improve their outcomes. For a variety of reasons, schools are seemingly more motivated than ever before to do as good a job as they possibly can with their students. And a lot of folks at schools have recognized that they're not there yet. They may have worked very hard and are doing a good job or a pretty good job, but nobody's accepting that anymore. Everybody wants to do even better. So while schools are saying we're ready to make improvements, there's questions about how do we get there. And before we talk about how we might get there, let's review what we used to do, the old response of schools. When we found students who were not succeeding, when we found students who were struggling, one of the things that we've done for a number of years now is the beloved wait to fail procedure method. We would just wait long enough until we would get that magical IQ achievement discrepancy, and it was then and only then for many schools where we were able to identify and serve the needs of students. Another thing that historically we've tried is hope and pray. We do a lot of that in schools, and we hope that never goes away. We're going to continue to do that. But what we are doing today, we are leaving behind across this country and in other countries as well, leaving this notion behind that we have to wait for students to fail. And we are moving in a direction that I happen to think is a much better direction. So I'm going to assume that most of you have heard about RTI. It wasn't long ago before, if I asked that question, if most of you heard about RTI, that many people had not. And so I know that from my conversations with many of you that there's a significant number of people in this room who that is their major job these days, is organizing, coordinating, working within an RTI structure. Some people are many years down the road with this new-ish method, procedure. Some people are just getting started. So the purpose of this training is not, this session is not to train on RTI. So I just want to hit some of the highlights because I think I believe that it's the RTI framework that's helping us understand how to collect and use appropriate assessment data. Many, many definitions for RTI. I think this one is reasonably good. That RTI is a process. I think that's a good thing to think about too. It's a process where we watch and measure students' response And this next part is very appropriate too. We need to be watching how they respond, not just to normal, everyday, run-of-the-mill instruction, but one of the aspects of RTI is that we need to be working ever harder to be sure that we are providing high-quality instruction that's appropriate to the student's needs, that has a basis in research-based evidence, that we can't just make things up anymore. So when we do work hard to provide high-quality, appropriate, evidence-based education instruction to a student, we watch how they respond. If they respond appropriately, we all cheer and applaud and keep going. If they're not, then we have increasingly intensive tiers of alternative services, supplementary services that we can provide to students. And one of the things that makes RTI such a challenge is that it is only a framework, so it's going to look different. It does certainly look different from state to state, from district to district, from school to school sometimes. But there are some general goals. Even though it's a process and it will look different, there are some goals that remain the same if we're doing RTI correctly, and there are some components that remain the same. I like to think of the goal in the early grades, K-3, as really prevention. All that we have learned over the last few decades is pretty exciting in this area of prevention, especially in the area of reading, where we have significant amount of research that definitively says that almost all children can be taught to read at grade level. In the vicinity of 90 to 95% of the general population of kids can have a reasonable expectation of reading at grade level. We know that. That is a fact now. It's no longer theory. What we need to do is to figure out ways to do that. We know what to do. It's how to do it in schools. But we also know, and the reality of education is that we are always going to have students who we do not achieve that goal of having them read at grade level. So we're going to have students in grades 4 and above who are going to need assistance. I think of that for many of these kids as rescue. If they're not where we need them to be, then we need to do everything we can to make sure that they are not just accommodated in their work, but actually assisted for every student to do whatever we can to improve their academic success. So these are some of the core concepts of RTI. If I were, and I do get a call to do this once in a while, serve as an outside evaluator for an RTI implementation, it's these kinds of things that would appear on my little clipboard, my checklist, as I walked around to look at classrooms. One of the things I would want to see right away, and I would be looking for, is in the Tier 1, the classroom, high quality core instruction. That is number one. That is job one, purpose one, goal one of RTI implementations. It starts in the classroom, and that's where RTI is going to succeed or fail. Another aspect of a good RTI implementation is you are going to see a lot of assessments being done. I want to see good, appropriate data being collected for students and used by teachers to make decisions. Then I want to see that this school has some kind of mechanism to respond to that data. They're not just collecting data and filling out spreadsheets and checklists and forms, but they are actually taking action so that students don't sit around, wait to fail, or continue to receive instruction that clearly is not working for them. And probably the icing on the cake for this is this notion in the highest quality RTI implementations, there are efforts to collaborate with the student's home, and that really takes this to that next level. So although it can look very, very different from, as I said, state to state, district to district, school to school, these are some aspects that should be in place in every RTI implementation. And I hope those of you who are actively engaged in supporting RTI have found these resources already. I used to have some books that I would recommend to people, but I'm finding RTI is growing and changing and evolving so rapidly that books can't keep up with it anymore. So websites are where I find most people are getting their information and their support. And these are the four that I continue to return to over and over and over again, with great information being shared by schools who are doing the pioneer effort on RTI, what they've learned, what has worked, what hasn't worked. These are all in your references as well. I see you madly writing this stuff down. On page 20, of your PowerPoint handout, all of my references. So when I mention a website or a book or an article, those are there. So these websites are all there. I put a star by the National Center on RTI. You may not have known that there is a National Center on RTI. And let me give you a little hint about how to decode these things. Whenever you see the words National Center, that means that you have paid for this thing. A National Center usually indicates that it's a federally funded center, and we have a lot of them out there for all kinds of purposes, but RTI has a National Center that you have paid for, and from my experience, it's an excellent resource for information and guidance for RTI. You knew that I would not be able to have a discussion about RTI without bringing out a triangle or a pyramid. You know, we've got to have that visual whenever we talk about RTI. But just to keep you awake this morning, I have taken the pyramid and turned it on its side, okay? I don't call it a pyramid, I call it a wedge, all right? This is the Hasbrouck RTI wedge, but it's basically an inverted, you know, on its side pyramid, nothing fancy about it. So you know that there are tiers. That doesn't have to be 3 tiers. It can be more than 1 tier. The pyramids are used, or the wedges used, to visually demonstrate that the goal of RTI is to serve fewer and fewer students. As the intensity of the instruction increases, the number of students who need that should, this is a goal, should decrease over time. But one of the reasons I created the wedge was so that I could put this arrow at the bottom. Because I think this is one of the aspects of RTI that doesn't get sufficient discussion. That as the numbers of students are going down, as their needs are going up, there's also some other things that need to go up that we should be paying attention to. So I've identified these components. Students should be receiving more instruction. So that's what the word time means there. What should go up as the needs go up is the amount of instructional time. The next thing on that arrow is intensity. As the needs of students go up, the intensity of instruction should go up. And intensity is increased 2 ways. The size of the group. So we move from whole class to small group to much smaller group down to, as available and necessary, one-on-one instruction. So as needs go up, intensity. By group size, the other way we increase intensity is to narrow the focus of our instruction. So we think of Tier 1 as the goal of Tier 1 is to teach all of the key standards. As we go to Tier 2 and Tier 3, the focus narrows, so the intensity increases. Data collection. We do not need to collect the same amount of data with our students who are succeeding in Tier 1 as those who are needing Tier 2 and Tier 3 services. We do need to collect more data. Not too much, and it needs to be appropriate, but that goes up. And another thing, the last thing on my list there, under that yellow arrow, is the word expertise. And that's not to imply at all that Tier 3 teachers should be smarter or have more advanced degrees, or what's the newest buzzword, highly qualified, that they should be more highly qualified. I don't mean that at all. What I mean is, as the needs of students go up, there should be more brains at the table. So expertise is not just in the brains of one person, but as the needs of our challenging students increase, there should be more of us collaborating and talking about what we should do about these students. And as people are moving toward this RTI model, I have and others have noticed that what we are trying to do as professional educators is increasingly mirroring what professionals in the medical world are doing as well. There are real parallels between RTI implementations and what the medical world has been doing for a long time, in terms of Tier 1 being access to a highly trained, competent professional physician who checks, does a screening check, benchmark check. Everybody gets the same assessments. Occasionally, when we think about doing those assessments, they would be 3 times a year. In the medical world, they're typically 1 time a year. If everything looks good, we don't need any more services. In the medical world, in an ideal situation, as soon as it's identified that somebody might have injured themselves or have some mild health issue, they would have access to Tier 2 services. So there would be people working in partnership with your physician to take care of that. And Tier 3, we might envision this as the intensive care unit, where there is often a team of professionals working together. But one of the things I think we can emulate from the medical analogy here is that the goal of the medical world is always to move students or move their patients out of these lower tiers as quickly as possible. Doctors are deeply trained in terms of standards, but their standards, of course, not academic standards. Their standards are standards of health and wellness. And their goal continuously is to use their tools to move the patient as quickly as possible back to the standard of health and wellness that's appropriate for their gender, their age, etc. And that's something I think that RTI aspires to, but we're not terribly good at that as education. We tend to put students in a program and they stay there forever. So I think that increased collaboration with those clear goals of RTI is to identify needs, serve students quickly, and then move on. RTI has aspects in the academic side that address both assessment issues at the various tiers as well as instruction at the various tiers. So that's why I wanted you to pull out that the little brochure that is in your section, because I've borrowed that diagram there just as a reminder. I'm not going to spend a lot of time with that today, but just to acknowledge that there are different types of assessments that we do at the tiers, and then we respond differently in terms of academic services for the students. So here we go deeply into the analogy. For the remainder of our time today, I'm going to use the analogy of educators as physicians with the focusing on the assessment piece, and use that as a framework for talking about 3 kinds of assessments that I know you're all very familiar with: benchmark screening assessment, diagnostic, and progress monitoring, to show the similarity with how those assessments that we use mirror what physicians use, and again with that goal of collecting just enough data, the right data, to inform our professional decisions, and then getting on to what's really important, which of course is the instruction of our students. So let's start with the benchmark assessments. All assessments have a purpose. All assessments should be done to answer a question. And in education, our questions should be important questions. So with that in mind, the questions that we should be asking when we administer benchmark screening assessments mirrors what a physician does at the start of the process. When you walk in to see your physician, they're likely going to greet you, be flipping through your records at some level, but ultimately they're going to probably get around to asking the question, so how are things going? How are you doing? Do you have any issues? Do you have any concerns? Are you feeling well? But we would never go back a second time to a physician who did only that. Flip through the records. How are you doing? Everything okay? Great. You're what? See you next year. We would expect, even though we don't love all those assessments or tests being done on us, we expect a physician to back up their observation and our disclosure to them with data, right? Those tests, and for a physician at this level, how are you doing? Those are those universal screening assessments that every physician would do: cholesterol, blood pressure, body temperature, reflexes, checking in your ear, your eye, the simple screening assessments that every physician will do. Each one of those results with a score. And that score is then used by the physician to compare you to an expected benchmark. And it's then and only then, if everything looks fine, you say you're doing fine, the benchmark screening comes out okay, then the physician will say either we might need to look a little deeper or everything is fine. Benchmark screening assessments. In our world, across the grade levels, increasingly, we're using some kind of benchmark screening assessments, typically 3 times a year, administering that screener, getting the score, and comparing it to an expected benchmark. And we find that some students are at benchmark or above. Yay! We always celebrate when we find that. Some of our students are going to be slightly below expected benchmarks, and some of our students are going to be significantly below. The resulting decision that we as informed professional educators should make after we give these kinds of assessments is this. For a student who is at or above the expected benchmark, we can say, definitively say, but this is all we can say based on benchmark screening assessments, that the student is likely on track. You see the cautionary language there? For a student who is not at benchmark, either slightly below or significantly below, all we can say on the basis of benchmark screening alone is that they might need some help. This is one of the areas where I watch my professional colleagues have gotten off track a little bit, believing that benchmark screening assessments, which are often, as we talked about on Thursday morning, often those 60-second quick little assessments that have strong validity and reliability. They're good assessments, but they're not designed to tell us everything we need to do. They are designed to answer the question, which of our students might need some help? And when a student is not at benchmark, we can say they might well need some help. If they are at benchmark, we can say we have a lot of research that says they're likely on track. But as professionals, we need to always know that if we have a question about any student, that we would consider some additional assessments to verify and validate our decision. The procedures for benchmark screening, increasingly, especially at elementary students, we're doing what is called universal screening, where every single student in the 3 times a year, whether we already know they're a very high student or a low student, is getting these assessments. The main procedure that people are using are those fluency-based assessments, oral reading fluency checks at grade level, unpracticed passages, score for number of words correct per minute or sounds or letters or whatever, and then take that score and compare it to some kind of benchmark. And on Thursday I shared these benchmarks, or shared with you again the benchmarks that are used in some cases. They're certainly used by the Read Naturally folks to help identify benchmarks at the 50th percentile. We talked about the importance of focusing on the 50th percentile. Today, we're going to go a little deeper. So, and where we're going to go deeper is we're going to take this notion of benchmark and deepen your understanding or underscore your understanding about how to use statistics to interpret these scores. Because as professional educators, we are now using benchmarks frequently to make relatively high-stakes decisions about children. We must use a slightly more sophisticated method to interpret benchmarks. So what we're going to do is review or introduce you to these concepts: obtained score, true score, error or noise, and confidence intervals. All right. And I am not going to talk to you about these things the way that I originally learned them, because I learned them in a stats class like many of you. They went in one ear, sort of jiggled around in there, and then right away out the other ear. So I'm going to talk about these in a way I hope will make it a little bit more memorable. All right. I'm going to tell you a story. The story of true scores, and obtained scores, and error, and all that stuff. All right. So right now you can just sit back and relax and listen to the story. It starts like this. When a human being administers an assessment of any kind to another human being, and that assessment was created by a human being, at the end of that assessment, whether you're doing oral reading fluency or measuring shoe size or taking someone's body temperature or measuring IQ, doesn't matter. When a human being gives an assessment created by a human being to another human being, at the end of that process, you're going to get a score. That's what you would call it. That's what I would call it. There's the score. What statisticians call that is the obtained score. They make a big deal of that because statisticians, being rather obsessive-compulsive people in general, are frustrated with the fact that the only score they can get is the obtained score. Because the score they really want is the unobtainable, never achievable, never identifiable true score. And when I say the word true score, I always want to do something special with my voice, like true score. And in my imagination, I imagine true scores living way, way, way up in the celestial heavens. That's why we can never get them, because they're up there in heaven, perfection. We can't even see them because of the clouds and the little cherubs and their harps and everything getting in the way. That's where the true scores are. We can't get them. And I don't really worry about that. It doesn't keep me up at night, but it does statisticians. They just really, that's what they want to know. They want to know the perfect true score, and they can't get it. All they can get is their obtained score. But they have obsessed about this long enough that they've figured out some ways to deal with it. One of the things they acknowledge is, and that we all have to pay attention to, is that the reason we can never achieve a perfect true score is because of what the statisticians call error. I actually prefer the synonym, which is noise, because error implies something is wrong, somebody made a mistake, and that's not true. It's just that human beings, when a human being gives an assessment to a human being, and using a tool created by a human being, there are aspects of it that are imperfect. So I'd like you to think for 1 minute and possibly talk to your neighbor. If you have given oral reading fluency assessments, just that kind of assessment. If you think about an oral reading fluency assessment, where does the noise come from? Where do the imperfections come from when a human being gives an oral reading fluency assessment to another human being? And for the purpose of time, instead of asking you what you said, I'm going to read your minds. Okay? I'm going to guess that in this room of smart professionals, you probably identified 4 sources of error for oral reading fluency. One of which is the examiner, the person giving the test. As try as we might, we cannot be perfect about starting and stopping the stopwatch perfectly, about catching every error or not counting something in error that was really a dialect or a speech impediment from a student. So we make errors. The students themselves, they might just be coming down with the flu. They might not have had breakfast. They might not like you. Their parents might have had a fight in the minivan on the way to the assessment that day. They look at the story and they don't like the story. They're just not into giving you their best performance that day, whatever it is, the student. The environment is another source of error. It's a cold room, it's a hot room, it's a noisy room. There's distractions. One of my favorites, when I've given these assessments, I've given hundreds and hundreds over the years, you're sitting in a classroom giving these assessments, stopwatch is starting, kids doing a good job, and all of a sudden you're, excuse me, I am so sorry to interrupt. Would you please send Kevin to the office? All right. Fourth category, the assessments themselves. Try as they might, the creators, those human beings that created those assessments, are not going to make every single 3rd grade passage perfectly a 3rd grade passage. First of all, they cannot, because we have no idea what 3rd grade really is in terms of measuring it. The interaction between a student's interest and background in the passage, there's quite a bit of error in oral reading fluency passage. I don't stay up late at night worrying about that, but I know enough about statistics to realize that this is very relevant to how we make decisions when we use oral reading fluency assessments. So I'm going to, right now, give you the secret formula that statisticians have created in order to cope with the fact that they can't get the true score that they really want to get. And here's the secret formula. I advise you to write this down, because I'm only going to say it once. It's a bunch of letters. Here we go. Somewhere on your paper, write this. T, the letter T, equals O plus and minus E. So just a quick review. T equals O plus and minus E. So look up here on the screen. Is that what you wrote? Something like that? Turn to the person next to you and tell them what you think you wrote. Yes, that's the true score. So here is an equation that tells us what the true score is. The true score equals that obtained score that we got plus and minus error. Now, error can never be perfectly measured. It can only be, you're going to remember this from your stats class, estimated. Statisticians have a whole other secret formula for estimating error. I'm not going to talk to you about that right now because that's a little bit more complicated, but they can estimate error. And once you've estimated error, you can take the obtained score, which is easy to get, add the error to that, and then subtract it. And really what you've written, the secret formula that you've written, is the secret formula for a confidence interval. And a confidence interval, statisticians love confidence intervals because although we can never ever identify what the true score is, we can be reasonably confident that the true score lies somewhere in that range of scores. The range of scores has been created by taking the obtained score, adding error, the obtained score, and subtracting error. So, when we apply this notion to benchmarks, 50th percentile on Hasbrouck and Tindal norms, for instance, the benchmarks for oral reading fluency, in order to do this, we have to have an estimation of error. Jared Tindal and I have done our work and consulted with people, and he does the magic stats, and we have come up with a pretty big number. There's 4 sources of error in oral reading fluency. The number we've come up with to estimate error in any oral reading fluency assessment is 10. 10. So what that would mean is that when you look at the 50th percentiles, you would look at any of these numbers. Let's just pick one here, 2nd grade, spring, 89. You would take that number and say, if the student scored a score of 89, and you add 10 to that, and you take 89 and subtract 10 to that, that any score that falls within that whole range would be a score that is adequate, would be benchmark. So a score of 99 all the way down to 79 would be statistically at benchmark, because 89 is simply an obtained score. The true 50th percentile is somewhere between 99 and 79. See what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. However, that would also imply that a student could get all the way to 79 before we decided that they needed some help. And I'm not a statistician. I'm an old reading teacher, emphasis on old. And I'm not comfortable saying that we can allow a student to get 10 words below the 50th percentile before we start to be concerned. So Jerry and I have come up with some decision zones, and they are this. We say, based on our statistical analysis of these scores, that a score of 10 or more above the 50th percentile down to 4 below, green zone, good to go. A student who scores in there, we will say, is likely on track. If the student scores, however, falls 5 to 10 below the 50th percentile on a benchmark screening, we're going to say that student might be fine, but he might not be fine. So we're calling that the yellow zone, caution zone. If a student's performance falls in that, we might do some extra assessments, we might just watch the student carefully, depending on our situation. It's hard to see up here, but we have created the red zone of more than 10 words below the 50th percentile. So let's apply that to that number 89, the spring 50th percentile on the Hasbrouck and Tindal norms for 2nd grade, 89. So using this newfound knowledge, we would take 89 and add 10, and subtract 10, creating that range, and then applying that to the color decision zones that we came up with. We have 99 or higher down to 85 would be a green zone. 84 to 79, yellow zone, and more than 78 below would be likely need some help. At least might need some help. So let me give you some examples here. Here is a third grader doing benchmark screening in the fall. Their score, the obtained score is 78 words correct per minute. We could take that to Hasbrouck, Tindal, fall, third grade, and using our newfound knowledge and decision zones, we would say this student is at benchmark. 15 minutes ago, we would have said this student is above benchmark. Now we know, because of error and all these kind of things, that this student's score, 78, is simply at benchmark. It's good, we're happy about that, but this is not a gifted child, or it's just at benchmark. Does that make sense? Here's another student, a fourth grader in the winter who scores 104. Take that to Hasbrouck, Tindal, winter, fourth grade, 104. Now, 15 minutes ago, we might have said, oh, that student's not at benchmark, maybe we need to consider Tier 2 services or intervention. This student is technically at benchmark, but falls in that area that I consider, let's be cautious. The student might be fine, the student might need help, it's in that gray area. But we want to be sure that we understand 104 does not mean significantly, measurably, significantly below benchmark. Read Naturally has assessment tools, including their wonderful benchmark screening assessment called the RFBA, which is a computer-based assessment that results in all kinds of incredibly wonderful reports and information for informing decisions. It is all of the commercially available benchmark screening assessments by far my favorite because of the quality of the passages and these wonderful reports. So, moving on to the next category of assessment. Once a physician has started with the process, how are you doing, using benchmark screening, if something does come up that looks like we might need to go a little deeper, the physician is now going to ask a different question because all assessments are done to answer questions. The physician says, I wonder what's going on. Let's see what's going on. That turns a physician to a huge, wide range of diagnostic assessments. And we, as professional educators, have options for diagnostic assessments as well. Typically, we use diagnostic assessments after a benchmark screener, not for the students who are at above benchmark, although we can always collect additional information if we feel that we need to. It's for the students who are slightly below or significantly below. This is where we need to have a repertoire of quick, easy to administer diagnostic assessments. This is a commonly skipped step in schools that may be doing RTI. They are relying too much. Many schools are relying too much on simply the data that comes from benchmark screening assessments. As good as they are, they are thermometer readings. Your body temperature, you might have a fever, but does that mean you have the flu? Does it mean you have a ruptured appendix? What does it mean? Diagnostic assessments is what tells us that. But we want to do it quickly. So we only do diagnostic assessments. Remember the yellow arrow? The yellow arrow? One of the things that goes up as the needs go up is more data. So we're not going to do this with all students. We're going to do this with students who we think, for students we need more information. Diagnostic assessments are specific. In the medical world, diagnostic assessments are specific. If you're having recurring headaches, your doctor may use a diagnostic assessment of an MRI or a CAT scan, as opposed to if you fell and injured your ankle, they're going to do an X-ray of your ankle. So it's very targeted, very specific. Let's not overuse any of these diagnostic assessments. And we get the scores, and what we do with the scores is analyze them to determine strengths. The student seems to know these things already, but he or she doesn't know these things. If I'm going to do assessments, or I'm going to recommend assessments, I want to do them quickly. So my colleagues and I developed this sequence for diagnostic assessments, and we recommend that if you're dealing with the youngest students, K1, that you start at the bottom and you start with some quick assessments of phonemic awareness. If they don't do well on this, you better stop right here and start teaching phonemic awareness, segmenting, blending, etc. If they do reasonably well, you can go up and do some assessments of phonics and decoding. If the students are reading by about the middle of first grade or so, is where this would start up through the grades, you would start at the top. And we recommend quick, modified, very modified versions of the old informal reading inventory, listening to students read, doing a quick analysis of their errors. If they're at grade level, then if they're at grade level, we can continue instruction. If they're not where we expect them to be, it's often helpful to do a quick assessment of phonics and decoding. And this is another assessment tool. I consider it a wonderful assessment tool because I wrote it. Read Naturally, I'm very grateful that they published this assessment tool. Karen will be talking about the quick phonics screener as well in her session. If we're going to spend time as professional educators collecting data, it's really important to me that we use it. So again, my colleagues and I, there's a theme there. I do very little work alone. I like to work with other people. My colleagues and I have put together a checklist for diagnostic data. Once you've administered a phonemic awareness assessment or a quick phonics screener or a informal reading inventory or anything, this checklist can help you analyze the data. And we didn't include it in your handouts, but if you would like to take a look at this, you can go again to our website, GHA-PD.com, Gibson, Hasbrouck Associates, PD for Professional Development. There's a whole section on that website called Resources, tons of checklists and all kinds of things, all downloadable for free. So, and this diagnostic checklist is a framework for decision. It is not a scientifically precise instrument. So if you get it and you want to add some questions or rearrange the questions or take out some of these questions, you can. And is that in our references? Because I see you all copying it down.
No, not the resources part.
Okay. Okay, real quickly, GHA-PD.com. Okay, here we go. Once a physician has collected diagnostic data, the next step in their process will be to have you come back in their office and they will tell you the results of those tests, right? This is what we found. Here's your x-ray, bad news, you broke your ankle, 6 months later you're going to be involved in all kinds of things. This is what we found, and the next thing that we're all waiting for when we talk to our physicians, this is what we can do. You can start taking this medication, or we're going to do some physical therapy or whatever it is. The physicians have a vast array. I just attended a workshop where somebody said physicians have the capability, not a single physician, but that physicians as a group have 11,000 different operations that they can do. When they take you to surgery, there's the possibility of 11,000 operations or 6,000 different drugs or medications. So they have a vast variety of options for what we can do. As professional educators, we don't have such a huge variety. You know who that is? Oh, come on, people. That's a teacher. The gold crown with the jewels, that doesn't give it away. Now, this is what gives it away. That's the sword of instruction. The powerful sword of instruction that we know from all of the good research on instruction that it's that makes the difference. The quality of the instruction provided by the teachers. Powerful instruction is more powerful than poverty, IQ, family status, language levels, all of those things that we used to believe were unconquerable. We now know that good instruction makes the difference, and tools make a difference as well. And you've been hearing over the last couple of days about a repertoire of wonderful tools published by Read Naturally that we can use once we've gotten good diagnostic data I know that you've been hearing this message over and over again. As wonderful as the Read Naturally Fluency program is, it is a targeted intervention for students who have fluency issues. But if you have a student who has some gaps and holes or needs some support with phonics and decoding, you can use word warm-up, vocabulary. We've got Take Aim. So we target the intervention to the needs of the student, just like a physician would. We wouldn't want a physician to use high-quality, research-based interventions as a one-size-fits-all. You have a headache? Insulin. You have a broken leg? Insulin. You're having trouble sleeping? Insulin. You have type 2 diabetes? Insulin. Insulin is a high-quality, research-proven, appropriate intervention if it matches the diagnosis. So it would be ridiculous if a physician used one-size-fits-all. We as professional educators tend to do that from time to time. Once we've started instruction, no, we're staying with the physician here for a minute. Once a physician has diagnosed and recommended a treatment, surgery, medication, physical therapy, lifestyle changes, whatever it is, we would hope that a professional physician would then come back and check and see how you're doing. And that would be to monitor your progress. And clearly, as professional educators, we have sets of tools that we can use to monitor our students' progress as well. Collecting assessment data is essential and vital to our work as professional educators. But we don't want to spend time collecting data that interferes with instruction. We want to collect the appropriate data as quickly as possible. So we're going to collect different data. Now again, that yellow arrow across the bottom of my wedge said we collect more data when the student's needs are greater. So if students, we're going to differentially apply this as well to our students. We're going to look differently at the on-level Tier 1 students and the students who are receiving Tier 2 and Tier 3 services. And these types of assessments, this level of assessment, this category of assessment, progress monitoring, plays a huge role, as I know everyone in this room knows, in RTI decisions. So we really have to do this right. For our students who are receiving Tier 1 services only and seem to be succeeding at that, really for most of those students, all we really need to do is repeat those benchmark screening assessments that we did in the fall, do them again in the winter, do them again in the spring, and be sure that we are backing up those scores and decisions with daily observations of students. I think we are perhaps sometimes diminishing the power of these assessments. We need to be sure that our colleagues have sufficient professional development so they know how to watch and observe their students on a daily basis, how to do error analysis while they're doing instruction, how to look at, over time, the results of in-program assessments and things that we do. Read Naturally, of course, supports that so well, but for many of those students, we're going to look at all that information and just go thumbs up. They are succeeding. They are making sufficient progress with the services they're receiving right now. But when we take a look then at our Tier 2, Tier 3 services, many of us have decided we need to be a little bit more systematic and more frequent in our assessment. So a lot of people return to that research of curriculum-based measurement that gave us those oral reading fluency assessments. We use those for benchmark screening, but we can also use those for progress monitoring. One of the differences is now we're talking about for on-level students the 3 times a year assessment. For these students, we may be using them assess as often as once a week, twice a month, and you see the question mark there, because we really do not have clear guidance, definitive guidance from research about the frequency of these assessments. We're much clearer about how frequent the benchmark screening should be. So there's some professional decisions here that need to be made about the frequency of assessments. But when we are using CBM, oral reading fluency, or fluency-based measures for progress monitoring, basically the procedures are identical that we use for benchmark screening, and they're well-grounded in research. However, there are some areas, and on this list that you're going to see, you're going to see some areas with red question marks, and that means that we do not have, from research, definitive guidelines to help you answer these questions. And as I said Thursday morning, I think I said this, that when we do have good, clear guidance from research, we ought to use it. As professional educators, we should use research when we've got it. When we don't have it, that's okay. We can use common sense. So the common sense and the research tells us that when we're thinking about using CBM for progress monitoring, one of the first decisions we have to make is the level of materials. For benchmark screening, we don't make a decision. Benchmark screening, every student gets grade level passages. That's very clear from the research. Here, we do have a choice. What we're trying to do, this data, all assessments are done to answer a question. The question that we're trying to answer with progress monitoring is the student making progress? So that always guides my decision about what level of materials to use. We do have an option. Both of these are research supported. We can either use passages for progress monitoring that are at the student's current instructional level. So if I were working with an 8th grader who reads at the 2nd grade level, that would mean monitoring his progress using 2nd grade level materials. An option that I have, supported by research, is to consider going up one level from the current instructional level. For that student, it would be 3rd grade. That would be called goal level. So that 8th grader who's reading at 2nd grade, my options are monitoring his progress in 2nd grade instructional level or 3rd grade goal level. The research indicates that both of those are options, and it may be better when we're talking about older students who are significantly behind. It may be those students where we would consider goal level passages, because my question that I want answered, I'm not going to waste my time collecting data if I don't have a question. But with my 8th grader, I have a question. Am I moving him toward 3rd grade? That's what I really want to know. So it may make sense to monitor him using 3rd grade. But that's an option you have. Once you've made the decision about what level, you're going to have to get a whole bunch of passages. You are going to have to make a decision about how frequently. Are you going to use one passage each time? We don't have definitive research, but some new research recently done showed that in this one study, using 3 passages for progress monitoring and doing it every 3 weeks in this one study gave these researchers the best data. It's a very interesting study. It's in your pamphlet. They do not recommend doing this because it's only a single study, but what they're saying is we need to be continuing to look at issues around frequency and number of passages. Both of those are decisions you have to make. Once another thing we have to do for progress monitoring is set up a graph with an aim line. And the reason we do this is because once we plot the scores on the students, whether we're measuring them weekly or every other week or whatever, we put those scores on the graph and we use those to determine whether a student's making progress or not. If they are not making progress, and the general guideline from research is this: if 4 scores in a row, 4 consecutive scores fall below the aim line, we need to consider making some kind of adjustment in the instruction. My colleagues and I have put together a checklist for what to consider, and that is also available at the GHA-PD.com website. It's simply a checklist. If a student is not making progress, how a group of colleagues, I believe it should be a group of colleagues, would sit around and say, should we consider adjusting or modifying the instruction in any of these categories? Now, the last thing I want to show you, and I'm getting the signal from the back of the room that I only have a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to do this very quickly, but this might be kind of intriguing, and I'm going to assume it may be new for some of you in this room. When you are putting data on a progress monitoring graph, most of us simply put every single score on the graph. Here's your obtained score, put it on the graph. Next week I get a new score, put it on the graph. Next week I get another score, put it on the graph. And that's perfectly acceptable. And when you do that, we often get graphs that look like this. Does this look familiar to you? Those of you who have been doing? Yeah. We expect that there's going to be some kind of bounce. And we may understand that a little bit more now because each one of those scores, one of those dots, is an obtained score. And what do we know about obtained scores? There's error. So some of that bounces simply errors. That just kills statisticians. They can't stand that. So they have created yet another tricky process for modulating or addressing the error in progress monitoring graphs. It's an exciting procedure called floating median technique. And when you use the floating median technique, you can take this same data, this is Amy's data, here are her scores, with exactly the same scores, you can get a graph that instead of this, looks like this. Exactly the same data. Now, is this graph more interpretable? I think it is. Amy could look at that and say, hey, I'm really making progress, whereas we looked at that, you know, over time it might look like we're making, and it's not cheating. This is statistically feasible. All it has done, here's where I'm going to go really, really quickly on how to do this. To do this, you need to get a median score. So you wait for 3 weeks or 3 scores. You need 3 scores. Once you have 3 consecutive scores, you simply take the score that is numerically in the middle. Arithmetic, you don't have to do any math. I love this. You just look at the 3 scores, which one is in the middle numerically, and that goes on the graph. You see what I'm doing here? Her first score 59, then 74, 62. 62 is numerically in the middle, so that goes on the graph. Next week, her score is 57. We take the 3 consecutive scores, 74, 62, 57. Numerically, 62 is still in the middle, so that goes on the graph. You can stand up if you can't see. I know this is at the bottom. The next week, her score is 66. 62 is still in the middle. And now I'm going to go really fast across the bottom here. 57, 66, 71, 71 again, 70 now, 70 again, 74. And those are the scores that go on the graph. Does that make sense? Yes. And all that's being done, so again, this score is this graph is exactly this graph. Exactly the same. But it's what the statisticians, they like this procedure because it reduces, they assume that the highest scores and the lowest scores represent more error than truth. So it smooths the data, that's a statistical term, or it is, smooths the data, or modulates the amount of error. So that's a technique that you can use. The Read Naturally people also have a fantastic set of a tool called the Reading Fluency Progress Monitor that Karen will talk about in her session that has terrific passages to use, and you can use that for your progress monitoring as well. And Karen will explain that. If this whole discussion, quick discussion of progress monitoring, went a little fast for you, again, there are some books. In this case, there is a book called The ABCs of CBM and some websites that you can go to. Oh, here, remember this? National Center. Okay, you remember what that means? You paid for it. Okay, there is a National Center on Student Progress Monitoring that you can go to. All right, so to recap this hour that went by very quickly, we as professional educators can mirror the work of physicians by administering screening and diagnostic assessments, taking that information and teaching, monitoring our students' progress and teaching, and simply repeating as necessary. We've got lots of tools and support from Read Naturally to do that, and I want to thank you very much.